The 1939 New York World's Fair. A fair intended to show what the future would be like, and a major element of that future was transportation. Being the 1930s, many American railroads jumped on the opportunity to show off their new streamliners and powerful freight engines to such a large number of people at this event. The railroad exhibits were by far the most expansive of all the ones at the fair, with engines of all types taking part, from ancient pioneering ones to massive streamliners and even the first EMC diesels. However, buried amongst all these American-designed locos, a relatively little streamliner from a foreign land stood out like a sore thumb. A British LMS Coronation class and coaches. This is the story of how they got there. In 1933, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, or LMS for short, sent their most famous locomotive, Royal Scot, on an expansive tour of the United States. The tour was only supposed to be a short visit, but it ended up being so popular that they sent Royal Scot all over the US and Canada. After it returned, things returned to normal on the LMS for a while. That was until the LNER's famous Flying Scotsman broke 100 miles an hour and made the LMS seem like a slow railway. Then the LNER built the A4 class, which was the first streamlined locomotive in Britain. The LMS decided that they needed to strike back with an ever better and more impressive streamliner. That was how the Coronation class was created. The first locomotive of the class, numbered 6220 and fittingly named Coronation, instantly proved its worth by breaking the LNER speed record and reaching 114 miles an hour. This, alongside its appearance in an LMS promotional film, made the 6220 a very famous and popular engine. Its popularity gave the LMS officials an idea. Over in the US, the heavily publicized 1939 New York World's Fair was going to happen soon, and they thought it would be a great addition to the locomotive displays at the fair. Judging from Royal Scot's tour a few years prior, this tour would also provide a very positive PR boost for the LMS. They managed to make a deal with the B&O Railroad in the US, who had hosted the Royal Scots tour, to host Coronation and display it alongside B&O equipment. Now that the tour was all set up, the logical thing would be to go get the 6220 Coronation and ship it to the US. But they decided not to use it. The Coronation had already been in service for a while at this point, and there were worries that it had sustained some damage after its record run. And there was no way they were going to risk the embarrassment of the locomotive that was supposed to be a publicity stunt for their company breaking down in the middle of the US and having to be rescued. So they decided instead to use the newest Coronation class engine built, 6229 Duchess of Hamilton, but disguise it as the 6220 Coronation, as it was far more well known. The locomotive was repainted to have 6220 on its sides, and the number boards were swapped with the actual 6220. Afterwards, it was fitted with a headlamp and bell to meet American railroad regulations, was given a specially modified set of Coronation coaches, and made a special run from Euston Station to the southern end of LMS rails, during which it met up and raced a plane. The bell was removed for this section of the journey, as there was a tunnel en route which the train couldn't clear with the bell attached. It was reattached at Southampton docks. Once they were at said docks, the locomotive was stripped of all parts that could easily fall off en route, including side rods, valve gear, and the front of the streamlining. Then it and the coaches were lifted off British soil and loaded onto a cargo ship called the LMS Belpamia for the trip across the Atlantic. The whole operation reportedly only took 7 minutes. Talk about quick. With it now on the ship, it was time for this marvel of modern steam to meet the United States. As per agreement with the B&O, the engine was unloaded at their port in Baltimore, Maryland. The weather there was so bad that the train's assigned crew got sick with pneumonia, and Robert Riddles, yes, the Robert Riddles you're thinking of, took over as fireman, while the original fireman became driver, as he made a swift recovery. As the engine was being steamed up for the first time in the US, major issues were found with the American coal, as it was smaller and had a far lower quality than the British coal that the 6229 was designed to run on. Not only that, it also burned so hot that it damaged the firebox, and repairs were required at several stops along the tour's route. These coal issues would plague the engine for the rest of its time in the US. Since it was January and they didn't have to be at the World's Fair until April, they decided to do a tour similar to Royal Scots back in 1934. The first leg, which more or less served as a test run, was along the B&O from Baltimore to the U.S. capital, Washington, D.C. This was when the issues with the coal really started to annoy the crew, with the engine having mechanical failures left and right, but still managing to complete the journey without stopping. Many of these issues would be rectified when the engine reached D.C. Here the tour officially began, and a large display event was organized, with 2 dogs brought along to promote it. After the display, the LMS and B&O ran several publicity and photographers' excursions, starting with a staged race between a B&O EMC EA diesel and the 6229 for an excursion back to Baltimore. This was also the first part of the tour where passengers were allowed to ride on the train. Then it took part in a crazy display event in DC that included the P7D, the EMC EA, and a PRR GG1 electric. They then left the city, racing the B&O P7D for this very popular shot of the tour, which is, to my knowledge, the most circulated photo of it, before then returning and racing the B&O EA and the GG1 for an excursion. Before the engine then headed to and was briefly displayed in Philadelphia, officially beginning the tour as the excursions were over by this point. Then it made the difficult trip over the Pennsylvania Railroad through central PA, even passing through the world-famous Horseshoe Curve, before making it to Pittsburgh. After a brief stop, it headed to Cincinnati, Ohio, before then turning onto the Louisville and Nashville Railroad to head to its only Kentucky stop of Louisville. The engine was so impressive that it became the focus of an issue of the L&N's Employee magazine, where several L&N railroaders left rather positive reviews of the train. Then it headed north to Indianapolis and eventually to Chicago, the place where the previous LMS Royal Scot tour had ended. In Chicago, the train was fitted with flags on its side for the first time, which had become a trend for the rest of the display events. The engine also had a special American whistle fitted, which was intended to remain as 6229's permanent new whistle as a sort of souvenir of the tour, but it was removed and lost when the engine returned to the UK. Some sources state the engine got the whistle in Baltimore, but more said Chicago, so I'm going with that. After the Chicago display, the engine steamed north again to Detroit, now on the rails of the New York Central, where it would remain for a while. After yet another display event, it headed back south into Ohio and stopped in Cleveland. Then it continued on the New York Central up into their namesake state of New York, making stops in Buffalo and Albany, and then crossing into Massachusetts for a visit to Boston. With the date of the World's Fair fast approaching, they now had to start heading towards New York City. While doing that, they made one more display stop in Hartford, Connecticut, which became the most popular stop on the tour. On April 14, 1939, after traveling 3,121 miles on U.S. soil, the train finally arrived at its ultimate destination, New York City and the 1939 New York World's Fair. The LMS, and by extension the tour train, was given its own display site at the fair rather than sharing the B&O's site as originally planned. The locomotive was displayed at the end of the railroad exhibits alongside Lackawanna M1 Class 464 number 1940, PRR M1 482 number 6759, PRR GG1 number 4888, and 2 other European visitors in the form of an Italian State Railways 2-car articulated ETR 212 train set and a 3-car high-speed ETR 200 train set. Like most engines at the fair, the 6229 had a stairway installed, which allowed visitors to climb into the cab in the coaches. The display would last for the whole 1939 fair and was one of the most popular railroad exhibits while it was there. During the display, the whole crew returned to the UK as the engine wouldn't need to move during the summer, with the plan for them to return in October once the fair was over and shuttle the engine back to Baltimore so it could have returned to the UK. Little did they know they wouldn't be seeing the Coronation again for 3 long years. In September of 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, officially beginning World War II. Despite this, 6229 remained at the fair until it ended in October of 1939. The war meant that the train couldn't be immediately shipped back to the UK as originally planned, as it was deemed too dangerous. Now, the 6229 was seen as an asset to the war effort, and they didn't want to risk its ship getting sunk by a German submarine. However, since the LMS and B&O were good friends, the B&O offered to store the engine indoors and away from the elements at their Fells Point engine facility in Baltimore. The locomotive was towed there in November of 1939 and would remain tucked away inside the shop for 3 years. Meanwhile, the coaches would find use away from the engine as they were refitted into Army living quarters for the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. They were all moved via the B&O and NYC to their temporary new home at the Army base in Jeffersonville, Indiana. In 1943, a large transport spot opened on a ship that was traveling in a convoy with military vessels, and it was decided to send 6229 back to Britain on it. The engine was delivered dead in tow back to the port in Baltimore and finally set off back for its home in the UK. The engine arrived safely at Cardiff Docks and was sent straight to Crewe, where it was given an overhaul, repainted into wartime black, and finally swapped its identity back with the real 6220 Coronation, once again becoming Duchess of Hamilton. It was during this overhaul that the American whistle was lost and replaced with a standard one. The engine entered back in LMS service to aid in the war effort. After the war ended, the coaches were finally taken back to Baltimore and shipped back home as well. After the war, the engine, along with all the other Coronations, was unstreamlined to simplify maintenance. It came under British Railways ownership in 1948, was renumbered to 46299, and was eventually withdrawn in 1964. The engine was then purchased by Billy Butlin and was displayed in a holiday camp before being donated to the National Railway Museum in 1975. It ran some excursions with them before eventually being put on static display and then re-streamlined in 2009. Today it's still on display at the NRM in York and is the only locomotive there that has traveled to the United States. While the coach's fate is not completely certain, it can be presumed that they were all scrapped. And that was Duchess of Hamilton's 1939 USA tour. This was quite difficult to put together as the tour is pretty obscure and even less photographed. It was a fun challenge though, and I'm open to doing a video about any other steam locomotive tour. Maybe GWR King George V, the LMS Royal Scot, or any suggestions you could give me in the comments. With all that said, catch those units while you can, and I'll see you next time.